Hi and welcome to the session on sports foods and supplements, which is obviously a very popular area in sports nutrition. I want us to start by thinking about what actually makes an athlete great. We've got some examples along the bottom of the screen here of either individual athletes who've achieved excellence in their sport or teams that have achieved excellence in their sport. But what is it about reaching the pinnacle of the sport that underpins that performance? Well, from my perspective, you can't go past talent, motivation, opportunity, and some other really important elements, things like training and trainability. So what I mean by that is someone's ability to adapt over a period of time, resistance to injury, and nutrition is within that. But as a dietitian, obviously, I have a bias towards nutrition in terms of its potential role in sports performance. If we look more specifically at elements of nutrition, you may not be able to even read this. This is sort of event nutrition, plus or minus sports foods, and then the line underneath that is supplements. So this is my perspective on what makes an athlete great. And so nutrition plays a part, and if we consider sports foods and supplements, they play a very small part of a part. And I think that's an important thing to remember when we talk about the potential benefits of taking supplements by different athletes in different contexts. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about what sports foods and supplements are, why people might take them, what works, what may work, what we know doesn't work, and what advice to provide individuals when asked about sports foods and supplements. So let's get started. So what are sports foods and supplements? Well, we typically divide them into three groups. We have what we call sports foods, which are foods that are specifically designed for sport, and they are regulated by Food Standards Australia and New Zealand, so they're considered food products. We'll give you some examples of those in a moment. And we have medical supplements, which are nutrients, which might be prescribed for a medical condition. And then the third category, which is probably the one that most people think about when we talk about supplements, are what we call performance-enhancing supplements or ergogenic aids. And these fall somewhere between a food and a medical supplement. And at the moment, they remain unregulated, and that's opened up an opportunity for some independent testing to be done, because what we do know is that the production of these performance supplements or ergogenic aids is often prone to potential contamination. So from an athlete perspective, those who are trying to avoid potential doping offences will look for supplements that have some degree of independent testing performed on them. So let's have a quick chat about sports foods. Well, sports foods are specialised products, as I said, that are able to provide a convenient source of nutrients when it's impractical to consume everyday foods. So things like sports drink, gels, bars, some protein supplements, electrolyte supplements. So I've got some examples of pictures here, but you could fill the slide up with different examples of sports foods. So these are often foods that might be consumed during exercise, immediately before exercise, or in the immediate short recovery period between repeated bouts of activity when somebody may not necessarily be feeling like eating meals. So they're often very, very convenient. Medical supplements, the second group, as I said, they're used to prevent or treat issues, including diagnosed nutrient deficiencies, and they're usually prescribed from the advice of a medical and/or nutrition practitioner. So things like iron supplements, vitamin D supplements, calcium supplements, multivitamin supplements, and probiotics would fall under the medical supplements category. In terms of sports supplements, we often interchangeably refer to them as ergogenic aids. So the word ergogenic means work generating or sort of performance enhancing, if you like. So nutritional supplements come in a very concentrated form, usually as a powder or a tablet. So they're not like a food as such. They're more delivered as a medicine, but providing particular high concentrations of certain nutrients. And you can see there that this is where both the Food Standards Regulator and the Therapeutic Goods Administrator have sort of not wanted to encroach on the other person's space, if you like. And in that sense, they've fallen sort of somewhere between both regulating bodies. So why do athletes take supplements? Well, they can do it for a variety of reasons. They can do it to improve their health. They can do it to improve in the belief that it will improve their health. It may be that it does improve their health, but it may be a belief in health improvement. It can be to improve strength and power, potentially gain or lose weight, increase fat burning ability, and there's a lot of supplements that are marketed as fat burning enhancers, potentially enhance energy, improve performance. Don't underestimate that athletes are just like any other human being. They like to look good and feel good about their body, so to improve looks, potentially correct nutrient deficiencies. And some athletes take supplements for the same reason that we see in the general community. Fear of missing out, particularly under the context of other athletes in their sport who may be performing well or have shown dramatic improvement, and they espouse the use of certain supplements, and people start taking things in the belief that they need to keep up. And we also have athletes who take supplements for the reason that they're endorsed, and they are provided the supplements for free, so they don't have to pay for them like you or I would have to pay for supplements. In terms of surveys that have been done on athletes, they're very, very common, and more than half of athletes have been reported to consume these sorts of ergogenic supplements. So let's talk about what works, and this is a photo of Ron Morn, who is one of the forefathers of sports nutrition, and I really always enjoyed hearing Ron speak, and he had what he called the Morn's rules of dietary supplements for athletes. This was long before we had frameworks for supplements, which we'll talk about, and his 3 rules I think are really they're really insightful. The first rule was if it works, it's probably banned. The second one was if it's not banned, then it probably doesn't work. And the third one is that there may be some exceptions. So we're going to talk to you about those exceptions today, or to give you some advice on what are the things that are allowed in sport or not on the WADA, World Anti-Doping Agency prohibited substances list, that have some evidence that they actually may work, and put some understanding around the things that we know don't work as well. So how do we actually assess evidence in this sense? This is a fairly detailed slide, so I'll just blow it up. You would have seen from the first lecture, I showed you this sort of hierarchy of evidence here and said that, we have meta-analysis and systematic reviews, which is a collection of the controlled trials here, or a synthesis of the controlled trials at the top of our hierarchy of evidence. And down the bottom here, we have ideas and expert opinion, editorials and anecdote at the bottom of that opinion, and we have various levels in between. In terms of taking a sports supplement, this matrix on the side here provides some degree of insight as to the sorts of thinking that sports scientists and elite sports nutrition practitioners think about when providing advice to athletes. So we have, we draw from preliminary ideas, i.e., what is this supplement? How can it be used to alter metabolism? How might it be useful for sports competition, training program? Is there any basis for thinking that this might work? So is there an underlying mechanism that may suggest that this product X, is actually working? And some of that starts from ideas or concepts. So after you've got that preliminary idea or hypothesis, usually you would start to look for specific information that comes in the form of evidence to suggest that this supplement may actually work. And so in this case, you might look at controlled trials or controlled studies. So will supplement X, for instance, using a certain protocol, improve performance? Let's say we're dealing with a swimmer in 400-meter swimming race. Or will it improve marathon performance? So you look for controlled trials that have been done and understand the specifics of those trials and what populations they've been done on and what caliber athletes that they've been done. Now, some of that information can be used then to synthesize general advice. That is, does supplement X work? How does it work? And what's probably the best protocol, broadly speaking? What type of events might it work best for? So this is a summation. But usually what you're dealing with at the elite end of sport is some very specific context. And you need to ask yourself the question, will supplement X enhance performance of my marathon in a hot, humid environment when I'm also taking caffeine? And can I use supplement X for both the morning heats and the finals of my 400-meter swim, for instance? So it's a highly specific context that we're talking about, and then we would draw from any controlled studies or case reports that may relate directly to that particular sporting context. So when assessing nutritional ergogenic aids for potential use, this is an important sort of understanding of the thinking that goes in behind it. If there's no purported mechanism, if there's no understanding of a reason why it might be effective, well, usually the consideration of the supplement stops at that point. Okay. So I mentioned before that they fall, these sports supplements fall between the Therapeutic Goods Administration, which handles sort of medical nutrition products, and sports foods, which are handled by FSANZ, the Food Standards Australia and New Zealand. So sports supplements are then potentially manufactured under less restrictive conditions, and that has led to an awareness of a fairly large likelihood that some of these supplements may contain compounds that aren't either listed in the label or that the label itself may be somewhat inaccurate. And so this is considered around the risk of contamination, because obviously if you're an athlete who takes supplement X and it's contaminated, then WADA's position is that they are not concerned about how it necessarily got into your system. If it's in your system as an athlete, then you're responsible for it. So even under the auspices of a contamination of a supplement, and you'll often hear athletes claiming that during an appeal against a doping offence that they've taken a supplement and it contained a contaminant, that only holds so much weight when it comes to a defence, because of WADA's position that if it's in your system, you're ultimately responsible for it. But here's a couple of reports, recent reports from independent testing of supplements that were available in Australia. One by LGC and the other one by HASTA. And basically these reports suggest a fairly large amount of contamination in products that are available on shelves in health food shops and sports food supplement stores in Australia. And in terms of the LGC report, it was 19 out of 67 products, and these are protein powders and gels and a whole range of tablets and powders that are sold. And HASTA's report was about 10% of products, and mostly the contaminants are stimulants and some anabolic agents, and they're usually in fairly small amounts, but not necessarily always. So in terms of ASADA, so the Australian Sports Agency for Drug Analysis, they do independent testing. We see about one athlete per month testing positive to a banned substance, which is typically a ban of equal to or less than 4 years for a first offence. We do know that the independent testing that gets done by independent verified companies doesn't offer a 100% guarantee, but they are significantly less risky. And there's a whole range of companies now that offer batch testing for supplements, so that depending on the standard or the level of testing that you purchase your product from, it could be that all batches are tested, or it could be a subset of a certain number of products are actually tested. So these companies, their reputation is based on the fact that they have extremely high analytical standards, and that when you have a supplement that's been tested by one of these companies, they, I guess, endorse the fact that it doesn't have a contaminant in it. But as I said before, ultimately the individual is still responsible for what's found in their system. So if we're going to now look at, well, what works, what doesn't, and what may work, because we don't obviously know everything about sports supplements and there's new ones coming out onto the market all the time. We're very fortunate in this country to have an internationally sort of leading framework for providing advice around supplements, and it's been developed by the Australian Institute of Sport. It's called the Sports Supplement Framework, and for simplification, it divides all sports foods and supplements up into 4 categories: A, B, C and D. So we're going to go through each of those categories and show you what products are in the categories, and talk to you about what the categories mean. So we're going to start with category A, obviously, and the good part about category A is that we have strong scientific evidence in specific situations to support the use of these products, and that's evidence-based protocols, and also that they're permitted for use in sport. So when the framework was first developed, it came about through a lot of athletes coming to sports dietitians, medical practitioners saying, I want to take this supplement, or I want to take a supplement, which ones do you recommend? And historically, 15, 20 years ago, the standard response was none of the supplements work. It was the Ron Moor's laws of sports nutrition. We are bound by not providing or recommending any sports supplements. And effectively what happened was the athletes just went and took the supplements anyway without any guidance whatsoever, because they were, as I said, there's a whole range of reasons why athletes take supplements. And so the Institute of Sport basically identified that it wasn't good enough to just bury your head in the sand. We needed to be on the front foot providing advice to athletes around supplements. And so this category A is the supplement category that we feel comfortable in recommending. So what's in this category? Well, in terms of sports foods, it's sports drinks, gels, confectionery, bars, electrolyte supplements, isolated protein supplements, mixed macronutrient supplements, so things like Ensure or Sustagen, these sorts of products. And in terms of medical supplements, iron, calcium, vitamin D, multivitamins and probiotics fit under this category. And in terms of the ergogenic aids, caffeine, creatine, beetroot juice or a form of nitrate, bicarbonate, BetaAlanine and Glycerol are the 6 compounds that fall into the ergogenic aids or benefit to performance under certain circumstances, and they're considered category A supplements. So what I want to do is go through each of these 6 reasonably swiftly to give you an understanding of the mechanism of action and how it's recommended and in what context it's recommended that people take these supplements. So let's start with caffeine. Caffeine is an adenosine receptor antagonist. Adenosine receptors are located right throughout the body, so it has broad-ranging effects, but it blocks the action of adenosine in the brain, which is a compound which typically is associated with tiredness. So it stops the build-up of tiredness is one of the sort of primary mechanisms. So it reduces fatigue and the perception of effort, meaning that you can exercise at a harder intensity for the same feeling of effort, or exercise for a longer period of time and not feel fatigued. Now, personally, we've done a lot of work on caffeine in our lab. We've written books on caffeine for sports performance. There's a huge amount of research done on caffeine's effect, both within and outside of the sporting context. So it's probably, of all of the ergogenic aids, the thing that's had the most scientific attention given to it. What fascinated me was initially was this study by a fellow by the name of Terry Graham and Lawrence Spreet. This was one of the earlier studies that I read. This is from 1995, where there were lots of earlier studies on caffeine than this, but this was one of the best studies that was done because it was a repeated measures design, so the participants came back multiple times, and it involved a dose response of caffeine in well-trained runners, and the task was to get them to run on a treadmill until they had fatigue, but there was a whole range of metabolic markers taken as well. And I was very fortunate as a younger fellow to actually meet Terry, and this is me having a coffee with Terry, and I couldn't resist the opportunity to get a photo consuming caffeine with a fellow whose papers that I'd read for many years. So this study, as I said, was a dose-response study. They gave these participants either a placebo, so no caffeine, 3 milligrams of caffeine, 6 milligrams of caffeine, or 9 milligrams of caffeine, and asked them to run, as I said, for as long as they could on a treadmill, and they were well-trained runners. And this is the performance time, so a higher bar here indicates a better performance. And so they were able to stay on the treadmill for a longer period of time, and clearly what you can see here is that it's not a dose-response relationship. That is, you don't run longer the more caffeine that you've had. And in fact, the 3 and the 6 were slightly better than the 9. So once you got up to a higher dose, you actually didn't see a performance enhancement. The conclusion from the study was that the highest dose had the greatest effect on epinephrine and blood-borne metabolites. As I said, they measured a whole range of compounds that they thought were associated with exercise performance, yet had the least effect on performance. The lowest dose had little or no effect on epinephrine and metabolites, but had an ergogenic effect. So it was only a small number of participants in this study. There was about 6 or 7, I believe. As I said, they were well trained, but it's a relatively small study, and it's a time to fatigue study, which has been criticised in literature as not necessarily being the tightest study by way of performance because it's related somewhat to motivation. And in terms of athletic events, we rarely are in a situation where we just ask someone to run for as long as they possibly can at a given intensity. It's usually a fixed distance, and we're getting people to complete that distance as quickly as possible. So that was 1995. Moving on some years now, this is a recent British Journal of Sports Medicine review, and what we have some years on are now what we call umbrella meta-analyses. So these are a review of 21 published meta-analyses. So this is meta-analysis, as we've alluded to earlier, is a collection of studies. This is now a situation where we're doing a review of the meta-analyses, just to show you the extent of literature in this area. And what we can see here are different exercise tasks. These are confidence limits here, but most of them fall on the side in terms of their overall effect of being in favour of caffeine. And so we have different exercise tasks. This is aerobic endurance up here, and it looks like there's a very strong effect. Muscle strength, again, a positive effect, but less so. Muscle endurance, which is a bit more like the Spreet type paper. Anaerobic power, and down here, short-term intense exercise. So one could summarise that is that it's a very clear relationship between aerobic endurance performance and caffeine, but still getting some ergogenic effects in other domains of exercise performance. So a pretty unique supplement in that sense, in that it spans a whole range of types of performance. So as part of our research, we've looked at a whole range of elements of caffeine. This is a summary of the amount of caffeine per cup that you'll typically see in textbooks with decaffeinated coffee containing next to no caffeine, a little more in tea. You typically get about 13 odd milligrams per 100 mils in most cola beverages. Energy drinks have a maximum allowable limit of 32 milligrams per 100 mils. So a can of Red Bull gives you about 80 milligrams of caffeine, instant coffee and brewed coffee. One of the things that we started to research as part of my own PhD was how consistent are individuals' caffeine intakes from dietary sources. We know that when a product is manufactured, such as a cola beverage or an energy drink, that we have very tight controls over how much caffeine is in those products. But we have a large number of products that contain caffeine as a natural source. So obviously coffee, you can see here, contains typically more caffeine than tea. And obviously there's lots of different coffee varieties. There's lots of different ways to make coffee. So to what extent is this 82 milligrams, close to 82 milligrams every time somebody has instant coffee? Or how close is this to 95 milligrams every time somebody has a brewed coffee? Well, we've done some work in that area. There's some work published about 8 years ago now, looking at just espresso coffee. So espresso coffee is purchased from coffee shops where we went around and asked for a takeaway espresso, and then we measured the caffeine content of those espressos. So this is per serve here. The mean caffeine content was about 106, so that's not too far away from the 95 on the previous table. The standard deviation's 38. The minimum amount of caffeine though was 25 milligrams in a serve, and the maximum was over 200 milligrams in a serve. So that is a large variation in caffeine concentration. And so from our perspective, this is a critically important issue by way of an athlete who might go and take coffee before performance, is that they want to have an understanding of how much caffeine they're actually being exposed to or not. We then did some subsequent work taking some coffees from Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne. This was largely thanks to a current affair who gave us some money to do this, and we found sort of similar averages and similar standard deviations from the other capital cities that we visited. We've also then had a look at, within a particular coffee shop or coffee chain, how consistent are they? So these are all different locations, but again, the same espresso purchased from the same coffee shop, and you can see here from the Coffee Club, for instance, the mean's 113, standard deviation again is about 40, and you're seeing more than double the variance in the range. Gloria Jeans has a much tighter range. You're getting more caffeine, but the difference between the highest and lowest, 130 to 162 milligrams, so that's pretty close. Down at the the lower end of the spectrum here in terms of, so these are ordered by way of number of samples that we've got, but you can see here that's, you know, something like our McDonald's McCafes, you're getting a lower caffeine concentration and again a reasonably tight range there. So you know, this is still relatively small numbers, but it just gives you a bit of an indication as to how much variability there is from different outlets that are selling effectively the same coffee and using the same order. We've also had a look at the caffeine content of iced coffee beverages, and this table I'll blow up because it's a little bit difficult to see as well. So we've gone into a whole range of iced coffee beverages to have a look to see how much caffeine is in these products. I said earlier that the maximum allowable caffeine concentration for an energy drink is 32 milligrams per 100 mils. So that's stipulated by FSAN's food regulation around energy drinks. Any product that contains coffee is typically considered to be less than that, but they don't mandate how much caffeine's in these products because it's sort of naturally occurring. So if you have a look at these values here, so this is the mean caffeine per 100 mils, we have a number of products that sit around the 32, or in fact some of them are actually slightly higher than 32 milligrams per 100 mils. So these ones here, these Breaker Strong, the double espressos, the loaded varieties, this is an intense coffee here, all of these are around the sort of same caffeine content that you get from an energy drink. The difference being, of course, that these products are typically sold in 500 to 600 ml containers over here. So the absolute amount of caffeine that you get in terms of the caffeine per serve is usually more. Remember, the amount of caffeine, as I said, from Red Bull is about 32 milligrams, and because you get typically 250 mils of it, you're only getting exposed to about 80 milligrams of caffeine, whereas per serve, a lot of these products are sort of more than double that. As I said, you get about 13 milligrams per 100 mils in Coca-Cola, so it's much lower on the scale of concentration of caffeine. We also asked the manufacturers how much caffeine was in their product, and this is the percent difference to the manufacturer here, and you can see a lot of them are in the sort of double digits, some of them are in the 70s up here, so in other words, they've got absolutely no idea what's in their product. Okay. We also have a range of other products that contain caffeine. Obviously, we can get it from chocolate. You can get it in energy sort of shots. No-dose tablets typically contain about 100 milligrams a tablet. And we also have things like strips, mouth strips that are marketed for athletes, and they can contain somewhere between 40 and 80 milligrams per strip, and these things just sort of sit in your mouth. So there's a variety of different products that exist. So I guess that the take-home message before we move on to the next supplement is that it's highly available, it's well-researched. We know that the dose that's required from a whole range of studies is not particularly high. You're going to see very consistent ergogenic doses at around 3 milligrams per kilogram body weight. So that's about 200 milligrams for a 70 kilo average weight individual, if you like. And as you saw from some of those coffees, they're already providing that sort of amount. Obviously not all of them, but some of them do. It's the equivalent of about 2 no-dose tablets. And so, in terms of an ergogenic supplement, as I said earlier, it spans a whole range of exercise domains that may influence somebody's performance. Creatine is also a category A supplement. It's associated with increasing intramuscular creatine and therefore intramuscular stores of creatine phosphate, which is the stored chemical phosphate donator, which allows us to resynthesize ATP from ADP very, very quickly. So the more creatine phosphate that you have the capacity to add or donate the phosphorus from creatine back to ADP to make ATP very, very quickly. It's therefore associated with high intensity exercise performance, but particularly in the situations where there's limited recovery time between exercise bouts, and so you're needing to regenerate a lot of ATP very, very quickly. Typically you see about a 1 to 2% increase in high intensity power in most studies. Performance gains are not found in many studies involving running. but strength power type sports. Increased weight gain is associated with creatine supplementation, and we actually use that as an indication that the person's loaded the muscle with creatine phosphate, because they usually put on a kilo and a half of weight, which is in the form of water that's stored with the creatine. As I said, we see an increased strength and lean body mass from creatine supplementation. So if you are loading somebody on creatine, I'll explain the doses in a moment, and you don't see that weight gain over a 3 or 4 day period, then the person may as well stop taking it, because they're not getting the creatine loading response. So that's one of the other good things about monitoring the person's weight, is that you get an understanding as to whether the supplement's likely to be effective or not. Here's a recent review. This is 2017 meta-analysis in this case, it's upper limb strength and performance here, so mostly bench press studies. And just have a look at the numbers of them here. Huge numbers of studies showing a benefit from creatine. So this is favouring creatine over on this side over here. So this is bench press, this is chest press. So huge volumes of research indicating that it's going to improve strength. This is the recommended prescription to use creatine. There's really 2 ways. We suggest that there's a loading phase and then a maintenance phase, but you can consume a small amount over a long period of time to load up as well. But most people use about 20 grams a day over 5 days, 4 or 5 days, and that's usually split up as 4 or 5 gram amounts per day for the 5 days. And then after that period of time, provided that you've got the weight gain, then a smaller amount, 2 to 3 grams per day, is sufficient to load the muscle with creatine. Usually it's encouraged that those amounts of creatine are also co-consumed with carbohydrate, and that's in order to facilitate a insulin-mediated response and then uptake into the muscle. And as I said, you monitor weight gain in order to ensure that we're actually seeing a gain in weight, pardon me, and therefore a creatine uptake. Creatine's a fascinating compound, because not only is it found in skeletal muscle, it's also found in your brain. Here is a recent interesting review article suggesting that brain creatine, cognitive processing and traumatic brain injury may be associated with one another, that acute stresses such as sleep deprivation, exhaustive exercise, acute hypoxia, cognitively demanding tasks, or mild brain injury, traumatic brain injury, may reduce the brain's creatine pool, suggesting that creatine may be an important moderator of recovery after an acute stressor, and that there may be a role for some therapeutic creatine supplementation to increase this creatine, phosphocreatine pool within the brain, so that when one of these stresses occurs, that you may see a faster recovery. And this is an area of ongoing research and interest. And one of the main reasons for that is that creatine is relatively cheap. We know it's highly available, and we know that it's pretty safe from all of the studies that have been done in their sort of exercising environment. So I guess watch this space on creatine. Nitrates, really interesting and relatively recent category A supplement involving nitrate conversion to nitrite conversion to nitrous oxide in the blood. So basically the intake of dietary nitrate here, and there's a variety of different products that contain dietary nitrate. Usually they're associated with vegetables, green leafy vegetables, but in particular beetroot contains high levels of nitrate. So you consume those products. The nitrate goes into the digestive system, gets picked up by the capillaries, recirculates back up into the salivary glands, where some enzymatic reduction occurs from nitrate to nitrite, so NO3 to NO2 by the oral bacteria. So that NO2 then, again, gets swallowed back into the stomach and then is converted to nitrous oxide in the gastric acid milieu, so the environment of the stomach. And then that re-enters the circulation and has its biological effects. And those people who know their physiology will know that nitrous oxide has huge effects, particularly for vasculature, vascular relaxation, and so on. So anything that increases nitrous oxide in circulation is likely to have a vasodilatory, relaxative effect. And so, this is something that's had a reasonable amount of exploration done. So things like reducing blood pressure, increasing blood flow, oxygen delivery, and nutrient delivery are all associated with changes in nitrous oxide in circulation. So I guess the ergogenic effect of nitrates were first sort of discussed in this paper, which is only sort of relatively recent paper. It's a 2011 paper by a group at Exeter University in the UK, where they basically took a group of individuals and gave them some exposure to beetroot juice. So the dietary nitrate supplement was in the form of beetroot juice or a nitrate-removed beetroot juice placebo. And basically what they found was that this is, during exercise, this is increased running speed. The control group is the darker. It's probably better to look at group B here. So we've got the nitrate and the placebo. And what you can see here, this is this is control and placebo. And you can see here that there's no sort of placebo effect. This is oxygen cost during running. And what you can clearly see here is that when they took the nitrate, there's a lower oxygen cost for the same exercise intensity. So this is quite unusual, because normally when we see individuals exercise at the same exercise intensity, it should theoretically produce the same oxygen cost of that activity. But in this submaximal work environment, when nitrate was available, that same work was being completed with a lower oxygen cost, so a greater efficiency basically. So they suggested that nitrates cause vasodilation of the blood vessels, increasing blood and oxygen delivery, thus reducing the oxygen cost of high intensity submaximal exercise. And if you can do that, then you can have a huge potential to influence performance. So then, obviously, with that evidence, a huge amount of research started. This is one of the earlier papers from a lady, Naomi Cermak, the late Naomi Cermak, who demonstrated very nicely in some 10K time trial performance that those individuals, when they'd taken some beetroot juice, acute beetroot juice supplementation, were able to reduce their time trial time in terms of cycling performance. These are trained individuals here. So their power output went up, their performance time went down. And this is mean VO2 during submaximal exercise at two different intensities. And you can see here, so this bar and this bar should be pretty much the same, and they are. It's relatively low intensity, but this more modest exercise intensity. So when the demand went up, the same individuals under the nitrate condition had a much, much lower change in VO2. So again, a case of more efficient exercise at the slightly higher intensity exercise. So then it comes back to, as we've done with the other supplements, working at, well, how much do you need to take in order to get an effect? Basically, there has been a number of studies in this area. In terms of an acute protocol, the things that seem to work are 2 to 3 hours after somewhere between 300 and 550 odd milligrams or 5 to 9 millimoles of nitrate, you see an effect. You can also chronically, over greater than 3 days, load up. In terms of beetroot juice, this is one of the commercial products. About 70 mils of that product gives you about 300 milligrams of nitrate. So they've got quite a concentrated sort of source there. So 1 or 2 of these 2 to 3 hours before you compete is going to give you the sort of dose of nitrates that's likely to have some sort of physiological effect. But it is important to warn participants that you can end up with red-coloured urine, which can be very disconcerting, obviously, for individuals who aren't necessarily expecting their urine to change colour so dramatically. I mean, it is important to be aware that whilst beetroot and beetroot juices receive most of the attention, that's largely because it's being commercially produced, and also it has the opportunity to produce a nice placebo, a flavour and volume match placebo. There's a whole range of other products that contain large amounts of nitrates. So celery, lettuce, rocket, spinach, all contain large amounts of nitrate, right down to some very low nitrate vegetables, asparagus, artichoke, and so on. So understanding that there are, we do use the the term beetroot juice or nitrate somewhat interchangeably, but I think it's important to recognise that it's nitrates. It's just that most of the work has been done using beetroot and beetroot juice supplements. And bicarbonate, well, bicarbonate is what we call an extracellular buffer. Here's a really nice summary by Jan Lemur on how it works. It works as a aiding intracellular pH regulation by raising extracellular pH or buffering capacity. So it's designed to enhance performance, again, in short-term high-intensity exercise, sort of somewhat similar to creatine, in sprints lasting approximately 60 seconds in duration, where you produce a lot of lactic acid and you see a large change in blood pH as a response to the exercise. So the idea is to keep blood pH somewhat stabilised. Okay, so the protocol to take it is somewhere between 0.24 and 0.4 grams per kilogram body mass, consumed 60 to 1 hour to 2.5 hours prior to exercise, or as a split dose taken over 30 minutes to 1.5 hours time period before exercise. It's the standard baking bicarb soda that you buy from Coles or Woolworths, so there's nothing sort of fancy about it, but it can lead to gastrointestinal distress. So to minimise this, we have potentially co-ingestion with a small amount of carbohydrate-rich meal, or use sodium citrate as an alternative, or splitting doses to lower the sort of acute load. So it, again, has had a large amount of studies performed on it, and basically we have some broad spectrum belief that it works. Not all studies show consistent results, and that you're likely to have some individual variation, particularly because of the symptoms associated with consumption of bicarbonate. It enhances performance, but the effect is typically greater in untrained individuals than trained individuals, and this is possibly because trained individuals during their training have exposure to large changes in blood pH and sort of develop adaptation strategies inherently, which are then not necessarily able to be super compensated for by bicarbonate in untrained individuals. BetaAlanine actually works as an intracellular buffer. So it has a sort of similar approach to bicarbonate, but rather than being outside the muscle cell in circulation, BetaAlanine actually is absorbed into the muscle cell, or it's a precursor for carnosine within the muscle, and that carnosine is an intracellular muscle buffer. So BetaAlanine combined with histidine forms carnosine as this intracellular muscle buffer. So because it's a muscle buffer again, it offers the same performance benefits from the point of view of the types of athletic events that bicarbonate would, these repeated sort of sprint, high intensity exercise, limited recovery type protocols. So it augments intracellular buffering capacity, and has beneficial effects on high intensity exercise performance, as I said. Daily supplemented of beta-alanine increases skeletal muscle carnosine content, we know that, and that immediate defense against proton accumulation in the contracting muscle. So as I said, it's inside the cell. The protocol is about 65 milligrams per kilo body mass every day for a long period of time, 10 to 12 weeks. It's less effective again in well-trained athletes, and there's possible negative side effects, including skin rashes and transient paresthesia. So that's like a skin itchiness. Taking any supplement for 10 to 12 weeks in an athletic group, you're always going to have some individuals who just, it's just impractical for those people to be able to consume a supplement on a regular basis for that period of time. So again, it comes back to the practicality of who you're working with. And finally, from our category A supplements, we have glycerol. And glycerol is a substance which facilitates hyperhydration prior to exercise. So glycerol is the sort of compound that you would use where you know that your event is likely to cause severe dehydration. It's going to be a hot environment. The opportunity to drink might be compromised. So glycerol-containing beverages create an osmotic gradient in the circulation, favouring fluid retention. So in other words, you provide an environment where more fluid is going to stay within circulation. and so you need to consume glycerol before exercise, and you need to consume it with sufficient fluid as well. So the dose is about 1.2 grams per kilo body weight of glycerol in 26 mils per kilogram of body weight of fluid over a 60-minute period. So you can't just take the glycerol if you don't take the fluid. You need to take both of them in order to provide that hyperhydration about 30 minutes prior to exercise. So it really is an acute form of supplement, and there's some guidelines there on hyperhydration and rehydration after exercise. And glycerol has in the past been on the WADA prohibited substances list, but more recently has come back off, and it's able to be used without risk of violating an anti-doping agency, an anti-doping offence at this point. Okay, so I'll pause there and we'll pick it up in part 2.